What's up, guys? Welcome back to the Last Word Sports Podcast. I'm your host tonight, Scott Caverts, and we're going to be talking about the NFL playoff picture after Monday Night Football just ended, post Week 15. So let's get right into it. So we're going to start off in the AFC with the Baltimore Ravens, the number one seed in the AFC right now, and they are 12-2, and they're on pace to get a first-round bye. They are the number one seed, and they have the tiebreaker over the number 2 seed New England Patriots. So they're pretty much set as long as they win one of their last two games. Now the Ravens, the reason why they're so great is they have the MVP Lamar Jackson, who's been phenomenal this year. He has 33 passing touchdowns. He's rushed for over 1,000 yards. He broke Michael Vick's record for most rushing yards by a quarterback in a single season. The Ravens also have the best rushing attack as a team in the entire NFL with 202.1 yards per game on the ground. They have a really tough defense, a championship-caliber head coach. They're one of the hottest teams in the league. They've won 10 straight games since starting the season 2-2. And on top of that, they're on pace to get home field for the playoffs. So the Ravens are looking really nice. They're the one seed in the AFC right now. On offense, the Ravens are averaging 33.7 points per game, which is first in the league, best offense in the league. And they're averaging 409.7 yards per game, which is second in the league. On defense, they're giving up an average of 18.4 points per game, which is fourth in the league, and they're also allowing 314.3 yards per game, which is good for sixth in the league. So top six in both yards and points for both offense and defense. So that's really good for the Ravens. Now, their last four games, right? They played at LA Rams, won 45-6. Rams are not great, but they're a respectable team. They're 8-6, I want to say. So a 45-6 road victory, very impressive. They also beat San Francisco, who's probably the second best team in the league behind the Ravens. They beat them 20-17 in Baltimore. Their second to last game was they played at Buffalo, and they beat Buffalo 24-17. Buffalo's going to be a playoff team too. That was a tough game. So those are all good wins. And then finally on Thursday night, they beat the Jets 42-21, just smacked them down at home at Baltimore. Got an easy victory, proved again why they're one of the best teams in the league. So moving on to the second seed in the AFC. The New England Patriots are 11-3, okay? Now, the reason why the Patriots are so good, they have the best defense in the league statistically. They have the best coach of all time. They have the greatest quarterback of all time. And even though he's slightly regressed, he's still a very good quarterback. And they're on pace to get a home field throughout the playoffs, except when they play at Baltimore maybe, and they're on pace for a first-round bye as well. So the Patriots are looking pretty good. On offense, they're averaging 26.6 points per game, which is good for seventh best in the league, and 349.9 yards per game, which is good for 18th best in the league. So kind of a drop-off there in yards per game, but they're finding ways to score. Now, for the Pats defense, they're first in the league in points allowed and first in the league in yards allowed with 12.9 points and 268.4 yards per game allowed. So the Pats defense has been very, very strong. Now, their last four games, the Patriots have played versus Dallas, and they beat them 13-9. Dallas isn't great, but they're probably going to make the playoffs, so that's a solid win. They played at Houston, a game that they actually lost 22-28. Kind of a surprising game. Houston's been up and down, but when Houston's been up, they've been hot, so it's not a terrible loss. But again, Houston's a team they'll probably see in the playoffs, so they need to figure out a way how to beat teams like Houston because the next week they lost to Kansas City at home, and Kansas City is another team who they'll probably have to see in the playoffs. They lost that game 23-16. And then this past week, they played the Bengals, the worst team in the league, in Cincinnati, smacked them 34-13. Not much of a signifier of anything, whether the Patriots are good or bad. So then their next two games, the Patriots have to play versus Buffalo and versus Miami, okay? And this is actually huge because if the Patriots lose to Buffalo, they'll be 11-4, and so will Buffalo. But they have the tiebreaker over Buffalo, so Buffalo can't actually win the division. But if they lose this game, it will allow Kansas City to sneak up to the number 2 seed and get a first-round bye. So the Patriots need to win out to secure their first-round bye, whereas the Ravens, in contrast, only need to win one of their final two, and they're good for a first-round bye. Now, the Kansas City Chiefs are the third team in the AFC. Chiefs are 10-4. The reason why the Chiefs are so good, they've got the best quarterback on the planet. Yeah, you could debate, Lamar and Russell Wilson are up there, but Patrick Mahomes is phenomenal. You have to at least give him that. They also have great coaching. Andy Reid's one of the best offensive play callers in the league. Schematically, he's phenomenal. And on top of that, the Chiefs beat Baltimore, which is really crazy because the only two teams to beat Baltimore this year are the Chiefs and the Browns. And the Browns aren't going to the playoffs. The Browns game was more fluky. But the Chiefs have actually beaten Lamar twice in his career so far. They beat him last year and they beat him this year. And so the Chiefs are probably the one team on this list who actually has a shot at beating the Ravens. So the Chiefs are good. On top of that, the Chiefs' defense has improved a lot since last year. Last year, their offense was super explosive, best in the league, but their defense was just atrocious. And this year, their defense isn't great, but it's middle of the pack. They got a new defensive coordinator, Steve Spagnuolo, who, if you know him, used to be the coordinator for the New York Giants when they beat the Patriots in the Super Bowl. So he knows how to game plan against Tom Brady, get pressure. He's a solid defensive coordinator, and their defense has gone to average, which gives their offense a little bit more leeway when they're struggling. So on offense, the Chiefs are averaging 28.1 points per game, good for fourth in the league, and 384.4 yards per game, which is good for fifth in the league. On defense, the Chiefs are allowing 20.3 points per game, the 11th best number in the league. So their defense has really stepped it up this year, and their defense is allowing 356.7 yards per game, which is the 18th best number in the league. So Kansas City's last four games, they played at the Chargers. Well, it was a Chargers home game, but they played in Mexico. Chiefs won 24-17. Then they played versus Oakland, crushed them 40-9. Then the Chiefs had to play at New England, a tough game, won 23-16, which allows them the chance to get a first-round bye if the Patriots lose to the Bills this week. And then they played Denver last week in a snowy game at home, well, this Sunday, and they won 23-3. So the Chiefs, they're starting to get hot. And their next two games, they play at Chicago and versus the Chargers. You know, both of those teams, the Chicago's okay. The Chargers have some talent, even though they've been a disappointment this year. But the Chiefs should totally be able to win both of those games and potentially get, a first-round bye, if not, at least get a third seed. So then there's the Texans. The Texans are the fourth seed in the AFC. The keys to the Texans are Deshaun Watson and DeAndre Hopkins. Those two are phenomenal on offense. They've got a great rapport. And when Watson gets hot, he's one of the best QBs in the league. DeAndre Hopkins is arguably the best receiver in the league. Their coaching is solid. Bill O'Brien does a good job sometimes, but he also has some questionable decisions late in games, and they've lost some playoff games because of him. But another big thing for the Texans is they beat New England. That's a huge thing because outside of that, they didn't really have a ton of wins against good teams. They also beat Kansas City earlier in the year, though. So, but again, the Texans' biggest problem has been inconsistency this year. Like, they beat New England, turned around the next week, got crushed by Denver. But then this past week, they beat Tennessee in a game for the AFC South crown, basically. And so Houston has proved at least they can run with good teams. They're probably going to win the division after beating Tennessee. And they've beaten Kansas City and New England, who are two teams they'll likely have to see in the playoffs. So offensively, the Texans are averaging 24.4 points per game, good for the 10th best number in the league, and 375.9 yards per game, good for the 7th best number in the league. Now, on defense, this is where things kind of get tricky for the Texans. They're allowing 23.6 points per game and 379.4 yards per game, which is only the 19th best points per game number and the 28th best yards per game number. Those, you'd like to see those a bit higher for a team who really has a shot at winning a Super Bowl. So the Texans' last four games they beat Indianapolis 20-17. Then they played New England, who they beat 28-22 at home. And then they got crushed by Denver in a really weird game, 38-24, where they were losing 38-3 in the third quarter. But then last week, they beat Tennessee in Tennessee, basically to win the AFC South, unless things go really wacky down the stretch. So the Texans, they've been solid. They're 3-1 in their last four games, and their next two games are at Tampa and versus Tennessee. Now, both of those games are winnable, but they're actually tricky because Tampa has won their last four games in a row. Even though they're eliminated, Jameis Winston's playing for a new contract. They're playing a lot better football, and Tennessee is fighting to get into the playoffs still. And so if Tennessee beats them in Week 17, Tennessee could sneak into the playoffs. But at the same time, the Texans have the tiebreaker over the Titans in terms of divisional record. So even if they beat the Titans since they beat the Titans on Sunday, even if they lose to the Titans in Week 17, they can still win the division with their tiebreaker. So they might actually rest their starters against Tennessee in that game if they win against Tampa Bay next week, just to get their guys healthy, knowing that they've secured the 4 seed. So the number 5 team in the AFC is the Buffalo Bills. The Bills are 10-4, which is a surprisingly good record for a 5 seed, and they have the 5th ranked run offense in the league. That's one of the reasons why they've been great. They've been super efficient. They've had a great job at controlling the time of possession. Run offense is great. At the same time, they have one of the best defenses in the league, which has been crucial for them. They have really strong coaching from Sean McDermott, who's trustworthy late in games. And Josh Allen has actually been a great runner this year. I think he has 8 or 9 rushing touchdowns. So he's been phenomenal for them, moving the ball however he can, although the offense has struggled a good bit. And Buffalo has also played teams like Baltimore and New England very close. Both of those they lost, but in one-score games. So Buffalo's offense is averaging 20.8 points per game, which is the 22nd best number in the league, and 336.1 yards per game, which is the 23rd best number in the league. Again, not ideal numbers, but their defense kind of makes up for it by being the 2nd best defense in the league in points per game allowed, and the 3rd best defense in the league in yards per game allowed, with 15.9 points and 291.9 yards. So their last 4 games, Buffalo beat Denver 20-3. And that was at home. They beat Dallas in Dallas on Thanksgiving, 26-15. They lost to Baltimore at home, 24-17 in a close game, and they beat Pittsburgh 17-10 in Pittsburgh on Sunday, which secured them a spot in the playoffs. So their next 2 are at New England and versus the Jets, and so they have a chance at winning the division still. They would need to win out, and they would need the Pats to lose out. But the Pats get to play the Dolphins in Week 17, so most likely, even if the Bills beat the Patriots this week, the Patriots will clean the floor with the terrible Dolphins team and still win the division with their tiebreaker. And so the Bills probably won't win the division, but if they beat New England, it allows Kansas City to get the 2 seed, get a first-round bye. So Buffalo's basically locked into a 5 slot. Good team, good defense, but they're going to have to play on the road in the playoffs. We'll just kind of see what happens. The 6th seed right now is the Pittsburgh Steelers at 8-6. The Steelers have phenomenal coaching from Mike Tomlin, a guy who's won the Super Bowl before. Okay, they have a great defense, especially since they traded for guys like Minkah Fitzpatrick. It's really starting to come together. They're a really hot team. They started, I believe, 0-4 and are 8-2 in their last 10 games. And they've played close games against Baltimore, who they lost to in overtime and is probably the best team in the league, and against Buffalo, who's a very good team. So offensively, the Steelers are averaging 19.2 points per game, the 25th best number in the league, and 285.7 yards per game, the 30th best number in the league. Both pretty awful numbers. You'd like to see those higher for a playoff team. On defense, the Steelers are great. They're allowing 18.5 points per game, which is the 6th best number in the league, and 307.4 yards per game, which is the 4th best number in the league. Their last 4 games, they beat Cincinnati at Cincinnati 16-10. They beat Cleveland 20-13. They beat Arizona in Arizona 23-17, and they lost on Sunday at home to Buffalo 17-10 in a close game. Their next 2 are at the Jets and at Baltimore. So those are actually kind of tough games, and as you've seen, Pittsburgh isn't blowing anybody out. They're winning low-scoring games with their strong defense, and they could actually get upset by the Jets, and most likely would lose to Baltimore. But here's the key thing for Pittsburgh. If Baltimore, since they have the tiebreaker over New England and they're already up a game on them in terms of record, Baltimore might rest their players in Week 17, which could allow Pittsburgh to sneak into the playoffs over the Titans with a win against a backup Ravens squad. So the 7 seed right now in the AFC, and I'm including them because they have a shot at making the playoffs too. They're in the hunt, is the Tennessee Titans, who I actually made a video on earlier. Hopefully they can still make the playoffs so I don't look too bad. The Titans are 8-6 right now, and their strengths are that they're really hot. Since they put in Ryan Tannehill for Marcus Mariota, they're 6-2, and their offense has been phenomenal. They have super efficient play from Tannehill and from their running back, Derrick Henry, who has been great in his last 4 games before they lost to Houston. He had something like 599 yards and 7 touchdowns in 4 games, so he was really hot. Their defense is really strong as usual, and they've got good coaching from Mike Vrabel, who inspires the players. Additionally, and this is a key for Tennessee, is they have a tiebreaker over Pittsburgh if they finish with the same record to get into the playoffs as the 6th seed due to their strength of victory. So, offensively, the Titans are averaging 24.2 points per game, good for 11th in the league, and they are also averaging 352.9 yards per game, which is good for 15th in the league. And on top of that, on defense, the Tennessee Titans are averaging 19.9 points per game allowed, the 8th best number in the league, and 362.4 yards per game allowed, the 19th best number in the league. So their last 4 games, they played versus Jacksonville, crushed them 42-20. They played at Indianapolis, beat them 31-17. They played at Oakland, beat them 42-21. So they were really hot, and they had a chance to take the lead in the division by beating Houston on Sunday at home, and unfortunately they couldn't pull through. They lost a pretty close game, 24-21. So now they have to really fight to get that wild card spot. The tough thing is their last 2 games they play versus New Orleans and at Houston, who both will really probably be in the playoffs, 2 really good teams. It's going to be tough to win those. So those are the 7 teams for the AFC. That's probably how it's going to shake out. Really, the only questions there are whether the Steelers or the Titans could get the 6th seed and whether Kansas City can slip ahead of New England to get that 2 seed. So moving on to the NFC. Okay, the 2 teams with first-round byes, projected first-round byes in the NFC, with the way that they played so far, are Seattle and Green Bay. The Seattle Seahawks have the 1 seed in the NFC right now with a record of 11-3. They're actually in a 3-way tie with the Packers and the Saints. The Niners also have a record of 11-3, but since the Seahawks beat the Niners head-to-head, the Niners are the 5 seed wildcard team right now. But back to the Seahawks. The Seahawks' strengths are Russell Wilson, one of the best quarterbacks in the league, a super efficient quarterback. He was the leader in MVP in the MVP race until Lamar Jackson took over down the stretch. On top of that, Russell Wilson has won a Super Bowl before. Their coach, Pete Carroll, has won a Super Bowl before. Both experienced guys, both know what they're doing. Bobby Wagner is a great leader on the defensive side of the ball. And Seattle, is at a spot right now where they're most likely going to have home field advantage in the playoffs if they win out. So that's another key is Seattle's one of the toughest places to play in, especially in the playoffs with super loud fans. And Seattle also beat San Francisco earlier in the regular season. So that's another huge victory. San Francisco is one of the best teams in the league. So offensively, the Seahawks are averaging 26.5 points per game, which is good for 8th best in the league, and 387.1 yards per game, which is good for the 4th best number in the league. On defense, though, the Seahawks have kind of struggled. They're allowing 24.6 points per game, the 21st best number in the league, and 378.3 yards per game, the 27th best number in the league. Although their defense has been hot, and they forced some turnovers in big games, like against the Niners, where they got some turnovers off of Jimmy G, their defense needs to be more consistent if they really want to take that next step and try to win a Super Bowl. So the Seahawks' last 4 games, they played at Philadelphia, who might make the playoffs. They're an okay team. They won 17-9. They played versus Minnesota, who's likely going to be in the playoffs, beat them 37-30. They played at the LA Rams and just got crushed 28-12 in a really, really weird game because the Rams turned around and got crushed by the Cowboys. But then their last game on Sunday, they beat Carolina 30-24, but the game wasn't really as close as the score was. They were up big in the 4th quarter, kind of let Carolina get some garbage time scores. It was a solid victory. And the Seahawks' next 2 games, they play versus Arizona, and they have a crucial Week 17 matchup versus San Francisco, which will decide probably who will win the NFC West and who could end up as the wildcard team or a top 1, 2, or 3 seed in the NFC. So the number 2 seed in the NFC right now, surprisingly, is the Green Bay Packers with a record of 11-3. The Packers' keys are Aaron Rodgers. Even though he's not as good as he's been in the past, he's still one of the most talented throwers of the football of all time. You can trust him to get it done. Their defense has improved a lot from previous years. It's not great, but it's better. And, they're on pace to get a bye and home field advantage through the playoffs, except when they're playing Seattle. So the Packers are in a pretty good spot. Their offense is averaging 23.6 points per game, 14th best number in the league, and 336.6 yards per game, which is the 22nd best number in the league. Defensively, the Packers are averaging 20.2 points per game allowed, the 9th best number in the league, and 371.3 yards per game allowed, the 23rd best number in the league. The Packers' last 4 games, they played at San Francisco, got demolished, lost 8-37, which was kind of concerning. And then they beat the Giants in New York 31-13. They beat Washington at home 20-15, and they beat Chicago 21-13 at Lambeau on Sunday. So their next two games are at Minnesota and at Detroit, two divisional rivals. The Minnesota game is pretty big because Minnesota, I believe, can still win the division if they win this game and their next one, and Green Bay loses their last two. But most likely, Green Bay will end up winning the division. But again, this is a huge game. I think it's a Monday night matchup, so make sure to tune in when the Packers play the Vikings to see who can take the NFC North crown. So number 3 in the NFC is the New Orleans Saints with a record of 11-3. This is really surprising because the Saints are one of the best teams in the league. They just destroyed the Colts 34-7, I want to say, on Monday Night Football tonight. And they're only the 3 seed because they're kind of behind in this 3-way tie. But they're, and I just want to let you know, these are their stats before they played Indianapolis tonight. Offensively, they're averaging 26.5 points per game, the 9th best number in the league. 369.4 yards per game, the 12th best number in the league. Defensively, they're allowing 22.8 points per game, the 16th best number in the league, and 338.3 yards per game, the 13th best number in the league. So the strengths of the Saints are Drew Brees. He's a Hall of Fame quarterback, will soon to be Hall of Fame quarterback. Tonight, he broke the record for most career passing touchdowns, and he holds the record for career highs in completion percentage and most career passing yards. He's one of the greatest quarterbacks ever. On top of that, they have a championship caliber coach in Sean Payton, who's won the Super Bowl before. They're an experienced team. Michael Thomas is the best receiver in all of football. He's on pace. He could break Marvin Harrison's record for most catches in a single season with 143. And on top of that, this is a team who's really hungry. They feel like they got robbed last year, and the year before that, they lost in the playoffs to the Vikings on the Minnesota Miracle. 2 heartbreaking playoff losses these past 2 years, and they're ready to come back and finally win this year. And additionally, the Saints beat Seattle in Seattle, so that's a good victory. So the Saints' last 4 games, they played Indianapolis tonight, obviously, and won 34-7. 3 weeks ago, they beat Carolina 34-31. Then they played at Atlanta and won 26-18. And then they lost to San Francisco last week, 48-46 in a shootout in the Superdome. So that was another close game, showed that the Saints and Niners are both good teams. And when they meet up again, who knows who will win, but it'll most likely be in the NFC Championship game. So that was a pretty cool game preview for the playoffs. The next 2 games for the Saints are at Tennessee and at Carolina. Tennessee is a tricky one because Tennessee's kind of hot, but they should be favored in both of these games and will most likely win both and end up with a top 3 seed in the NFC. So the 4 seed in the NFC is the Dallas Cowboys with a record of 7-7. It's actually pretty funny that the Cowboys are even in contention for a playoff spot despite not having a record better than 500. The keys to the Cowboys are the offense. They have one of the best offenses in the league, with Dak Prescott, Ezekiel Elliott, and a phenomenal offensive line. They crushed the LA Rams, and they played a close game against New England. So they can play some good teams close. They also played teams like New Orleans close. But their D can also get really hot sometimes and stop the run. I think they held the Rams to under 25 total rushing yards. And they also, another key for them is they'll probably get a home game in the playoffs if they make it, right? Because they're not going to be a wild card. They'll get to play, presumably the Niners or the Seahawks. They'll get them at home, which is a lot better than having to travel on the road. Now, the Cowboys' offensive stats can be a little bit misleading because some of them come in garbage times where they're down a lot of points and then rack up a ton of yards in the second half and still lose the game. But their stats are still pretty impressive. Offensively, they're averaging 27 points per game, the 6th best number in the league, and 434 yards per game, actually the best number in the league. And defensively, the Cowboys are allowing 20.6 points per game, the 12th best number in the league, and 323.6 yards per game, the 7th best number in the league. So they've got talent on both sides of the ball. And their last 4 games, they lost at New England 9-13, close game. They lost versus Buffalo 26-15. They got crushed really there, and that was at home. And then they got beat badly at Chicago. Final score was only 31-24, but they were down multiple scores in this game. And then, super surprisingly, after losing 3 straight, they just annihilated the Rams, who were actually hot coming into this game, had beaten the Seahawks badly. They annihilated the Rams in Jerry World, 44-21. And the final two games of the season for the Cowboys are at Philadelphia and versus Washington. And this game at Philly is a huge matchup because the winner of this will most likely win the NFC East and get a spot in the playoffs. So the 5 seed in the NFC is the San Francisco 49ers with a record of 11-3. Their keys are their defense. Their front seven's phenomenal. Nick Bosa has been great. He's most likely going to win Defensive Rookie of the Year, and they're getting huge contributions from other guys like Eric Armstead, DeForest Buckner. When Bosa gets a ton of pressure and requires double teams, it just unlocks the rest of the defense and allows them to just go off against, one-on-one with offensive linemen. So another strong point for the Niners is their coaching. Kyle Shanahan, he's been in the Super Bowl as a coordinator before, and he's one of the better schemers of plays for offense in the National Football League. On top of that, their run game is dominating. They control the time of possession, and they've got some really good wins, like at New Orleans, and they've had some close losses to really good teams, like versus Baltimore and Seattle. So they've shown that they can play good teams close and have a shot at winning the title. They also destroyed Green Bay, who's the 2 seed right now. So again, they've showed they're a good team. Offensively, the Niners are averaging 29.9 points per game, the second best number in the league, 383.2 yards per game, the 6th best number in the league, and defensively, the Niners are allowing 18.4 points per game, the 5th best number in the league, and 269 yards per game, the second best number in the league. The Niners' last 4 games they played versus Green Bay, which they won 37-8. They played at Baltimore, which they lost in a really close game, 20-17. They played at New Orleans in the Superdome, went down there, beat the Saints in a shootout, 48-46. And then this last week, they were really surprisingly upset by the Atlanta Falcons, 29-22. And they actually had the 1 seed before this game and then forfeited it after the loss to the Falcons, falling to the 5 seed. And their next 2 games, they play versus the Rams and at Seattle. Versus the Rams could be kind of tough because the Rams are a solid team, but they're most likely going to win this game. The key matchup is at Seattle because whoever wins that game, assuming the Seahawks and the Niners both win in Week 16, the winner of that game in Week 17 will win the division. So that's a crucial matchup. Now, the 6th seed in the NFC is the Minnesota Vikings, and the Vikings are 10-4 right now. Their strengths are their skill players. Dalvin Cook, Stephon Diggs, Adam Thielen, some of the best players in the league. Although I think Thielen's kind of battling an injury problem, hopefully they can get him back by the playoffs, be fully healthy. Another key is they're really efficient everywhere. Kirk Cousins, even though he's not the best quarterback, has played super efficient football this year. They're great at running the ball in terms of yards per carry. Their defense is solid. They're an experienced team. They've been to the playoffs before, and they've got a pretty good coach who's defensive-minded. So offensively, the Vikings are averaging 27 points per game, the 5th best number in the league, and 372.6 yards per game, the 9th best number in the league. On defense, the Vikings are averaging 18.5 points per game, the 7th best number in the league, and 338.9 yards per game allowed, the 14th best number in the league. So a good team statistically. And their last 4 games, they played versus Denver. They were down, I think, 20-0 at halftime. Came back, showed a lot of grit, won 27-3. They played at Seattle, a game they lost 30-37. Tough game, but at the same time, Dalvin Cook got injured late in that game, and who knows, they might have won if he had stayed healthy. Then they crushed a bad Detroit team 20-7, and just this past week, they demolished the Chargers 39-10 in LA. So that was a pretty convincing win. Their next 2 games are versus Green Bay and versus Chicago, and if they can just win one of those 2, they'll probably be into the playoffs. But winning against Green Bay could actually help them win the division. Even though this is unlikely and they lost to Green Bay earlier in the year, this is a pretty big matchup on Monday Night Football. If they beat Green Bay and beat Chicago and Green Bay loses out, the Vikings can win the division, secure a home playoff game instead of a road one. So the 7th team in the NFC, they're not actually the 7th seed because their record isn't good enough, but I put them at 7 just because they have a real shot at making the playoffs, is the Philadelphia Eagles. They're 7-7, the same record as the Dallas Cowboys, and so they could win the unbelievably terrible NFC East. So the keys for the Eagles are they really play in a terrible division, and they have strong coaching. Doug Peterson's won a Super Bowl before. He's had some questionable calls this year, but I trust Doug Peterson in general, And they had a win at Green Bay, too, earlier in the year on Thursday Night Football. And Green Bay is the number 2 seed in the NFC right now. So they've proved that they can run with some of these teams. And another key thing for the Eagles is if they were to win the division and make the playoffs, they'd get a home playoff game. And Philly can be a tough place to play at. So that would be good for them. Offensively, the Eagles are averaging 23.9 points per game, the 12th best number in the league, and 352.9 yards per game, the 16th best number in the league. On defense, the Eagles are allowing 23.4 points per game, the 17th best number in the league, and 329.2 yards per game, the 10th best number in the league. So both on offense and defense, they're kind of slightly above average, nothing exceptional there. And a huge problem for the Eagles has been injuries. They've just been devastated by injuries and also drops by receivers. It's been a really weird year for the Eagles. A lot of people picked for them to maybe make the Super Bowl going into the year, and they've just been plagued by injuries and drops. Nelson Aguilar and Alshon Jeffrey, I think, led the league in drops before Jeffrey got injured, and their secondary is just ravaged with injuries. At this point, they're starting guys who were on the practice squad to start the year. I think against the Redskins, who they needed a game-winning touchdown in the fourth quarter to beat, the receiver who caught the touchdown, who might be one of their only healthy receivers left, was Greg Ward Jr., who was actually a quarterback at the University of Houston a couple years ago. He was cut by the Eagles multiple times, and then he finally got picked up to the team after all these injuries, and he got the game-winning touchdown. So they're really running low on healthy players, but the Eagles' last 4 games, right? They lost versus Seattle 9-17. But Seattle's a good team. That's not a terrible loss. It was a fairly close game. They lost at Miami 37-31. This was a really bad loss. If they had won this game, they'd be first in the division right now. But they choked it. They threw it away to a terrible Dolphins team. So the Eagles have definitely been inconsistent this year. Then they won against the Giants at home 23-17. They needed overtime to win this game. They came back down 17-3. Another, poor sign heading into the playoffs is if you can barely beat a team as terrible as the Giants and you lose to a team as bad as the Dolphins, but with how bad the rest of the NFC East is, the Eagles still have a shot at making the playoffs. This past week, they beat Washington 37-27, but it was closer to that than that. They got a touchdown on the last play because they were up 31-27, and the Redskins had the ball and tried to do like Dwayne Haskins was about to get sacked, and so he just threw the ball behind him to try to keep the ball alive, and the Eagles picked it up and ran it back for a touchdown. So the next 2 games for the Eagles are versus Dallas and at the Giants. So assuming Dallas beats the Redskins and Philly beats the Giants again, the 2 terrible teams, the key matchup here is versus Dallas in Week 16, because the winner of this game will most likely win the NFC East, win the division, head to the playoffs. So even though Philly got smacked by the Cowboys 37-10 earlier in the year, the Eagles really think they can win this game. And who knows, Dallas and Philly have both been terribly inconsistent this year, and the winner of this game will most likely be into the playoffs. So those are really the top 7 teams, the teams that have a legitimate shot at making the playoffs in both conferences. But before we go, I want to give you the teams that I personally believe in and the teams that I'm kind of struggling to buy heading into the playoffs. So the teams that I really like are Baltimore. Obviously, they're most likely the best team in the league. Pretty much everybody would agree with me there. They are going to have home field advantage in the playoffs as the top seed. They have the top run game in the NFL. They dominate the time of possession. Lamar Jackson's going to be the league MVP. They've got great wins. They're going to have a first-round bye. They have a coach who's won a championship before and who's beaten the Patriots in the playoffs, and their offense and defense are both really strong. So another team in the AFC I like heading into the playoffs is Kansas City. They've got a great coach in Andy Reid, who's never won a Super Bowl, but he's been there a couple times. He's very experienced. They have a phenomenal quarterback in Patrick Mahomes. Their defense has improved on last year, and their offense is still one of the best in the league. Spagnuolo is a much better defensive coordinator, and another key for Kansas City is they're one of 2 teams this season who actually beat Baltimore, which could be huge for them in the playoffs. They beat Lamar Jackson twice in his young career, and so they know how to do it, and I don't know if any of the other teams can actually beat Baltimore. So another team that I love is Buffalo. And I don't love Buffalo as much as I love KC and Baltimore, but I think Buffalo for a 5 seed is a team that I like and I think can do better than a 5 seed typically would. Again, they have a record of 10-4, which is very strong, and their offense has struggled, but they've got a really good coaching from Sean McDermott, who's turned this organization around and has made the playoffs in 2 out of his first 3 seasons after a 16-year playoff drought in Buffalo. On top of that, Buffalo plays really efficient football. They have a strong run game, I think the 5th best in the league. They control the time of possession, and they have a super strong D. And again, they've played some close games against good teams like Baltimore and New England. Now, another team who I like for their position is Tennessee if they can make it to the playoffs as the 6th seed. They're really hot right now, even though they lost to the Texans. They're still 6-2 over their last 8 games. They're efficient. They have a really strong run game. They can pound the ball on you, which is crucial come January in cold games. And they have a really good D and control the time of possession. They've got a good coach. They're hot. I like Tennessee. So another team from the NFC now is the New Orleans Saints. The Saints are experienced. They're hungry after 2 heartbreaking playoff defeats the past 2 years. They've got a great quarterback, a great coach, the best receiver in football, and they have the 4th best defense in the league against the run in terms of rushing yards per game allowed. And so the Saints will be very good against teams who strive on the run in the playoffs, who live on the run in the playoffs. Now, the final team that I really like going into the playoffs is the San Francisco 49ers. They're top 6 in both yards and points for defense and offense, which is huge. Their coach is great. He's young, he's smart, and he's one of the best play callers in the league. They've got a really strong run game, and they can control the time of possession, and they've had good wins. They beat the Packers by a ton. Their losses were close, like when they lost to Seattle in overtime and when they lost at Baltimore by a field goal. And so the Niners, I'm buying their stock. I think they're a good team. So the teams that I don't really like going into the playoffs, New England. I made a video on why I don't like New England going to the Super Bowl. I just think offensively they have a lack of talent. Even though their offense is solid in points per game, they've had a really easy schedule that's kind of inflated some of their stats, and they don't really have any good wins except for Buffalo earlier in the year in a game where Josh Allen got hurt, and they had to play Matt Barkley in the second half. So another team that I don't like, the Green Bay Packers. They don't really have any good wins this year. They've got some kind of bad losses, like when they got annihilated by the Niners or when they lost at home to the 7-7 Philadelphia Eagles. They've had an easy schedule, and they're not top 8 in points or yards on either offense or defense. So the Packers kind of concern me. Again, they also have a really young coach, a first-year head coach, so they're not super experienced. Dallas and Philadelphia are 2 other teams that I obviously don't like. They're both, super inconsistent, have really bad records. They're probably going to win the division with a record of 8-8 or 9-7, which is pretty low. Again, their division super easy. They've had bad losses. And for Philadelphia, the injuries are a huge problem. They just have so many guys out. It'd be tough to see either of these teams advancing very far into the playoffs. A fifth team that I don't like going into the playoffs is the Minnesota Vikings. And the Vikings, I actually like the talent they have on their roster. I like Mike Zimmer. I think he's a solid coach. He's not unbelievable. But at the end of the day, the Vikings just can't go super deep into the playoffs with Kirk Cousins. I like him in the regular season. He's an efficient quarterback, but the dude is terrible whenever they need him to step up big in primetime games. He's never won a Monday Night Football game in his career. I don't think he's ever won a playoff game in his career. And on top of that, Dalvin Cook, has been injured. He got injured against Seattle, and I think he re-injured himself this past week. So they could be struggling with some injuries to Cook, who might just be their best player, and that kind of concerns me heading into the playoffs. So then we're moving on to the Houston Texans. Now, the Texans have some good wins, which I like to see. They beat Kansas City and they beat New England, but they're just too inconsistent for me to really buy their stock going into the playoffs. When they lost to Denver at home and just got crushed, it was very concerning. And their defense is terrible. Statistically, they haven't been able to stop anybody. And Houston never advances under Bill O'Brien. His coaching has just been very suspect in close games and in big games. So I'm not really sold on Houston making a deep playoff run. And finally, the team that I don't really like going into the playoffs is Pittsburgh. I love Mike Tomlin. He's doing a great job. And I like Duck Hodges. But Duck Hodges is an undrafted rookie quarterback who was the 3rd or 4th string quarterback going into the season. He's inconsistent. On top of that, the Steelers' offense is just terrible as a whole, and they're not going to win the tiebreaker over the Titans, if they both finish with the same record. And again, they'd have to play a road game in the playoffs as a 6th seed. So I really can't see the Steelers advancing super deep into the playoffs. So that's all I have for today, folks, about the post Week 15 playoff picture in the NFL. Comment below. Tell us what you think, who you think is going to win the Super Bowl, who you think will lock up the top seeds in the NFL, NFC, and AFC playoffs. So thanks for watching. I'm Scott Gebertz. This has been The Last Word.